some general conversation about how we think about engagement, because sometimes how we think about engagement can shape what we look for, what we think is successful, and so on. We're going to look at two specific ways of thinking about how we might create opportunities for engagement. And then we're going to go into breakout rooms. We're going to have 2 rounds of breakout rooms. And in breakout room 1, you'll have a choice of forums, comments, Padlet, or WooClap as a tool to hear a little bit more about. And then in breakout number 2, you'll have a choice of the chat tool, polls, ask a question tool, or blogs as tools that you might want to hear a little bit about. And then we'll do a quick little concluding activity and we will be on our way. So, and this is where I already have to start flicking out of things. What I'm going to ask you to do, colleagues, is I'm going to ask you to jump into in the text chat, I'm going to give you a link to a Google Doc. I'm going to ask you to go to that Google Doc, and I'm going to ask you to add just 1 or 2 items of what you would like to achieve during this webinar. What would help you to feel like this webinar contributed something to your life and made it a little bit better? So I'm going to ask you to simply go to that link in the text chat, click on it. It should open a Word doc for you. And when you get to the Word doc, what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to grab one of these things that says add an item. I see there are folks on it already, and add something that for you would feel like I've achieved something useful this webinar. Okay, so just grab a line and over to you. And if you have more than one thing you want to achieve, please feel free to add that as well. So today's webinar is going to be a bit of a mix of things. We're going to look at some tools. We're going to look at some techniques, some strategies, and we're going to play quite a lot with some tools as well during the webinar, which should hopefully give us a chance to experience some of these things as well as try them out. So yeah, I'm going to let people keep playing with that. So you can kind of add items at the bottom as you go. If you get to the bottom and you want to, you can just add enter, and that'll let you add some more of these. This is just Google recently added this new little checklist function, which is quite useful. Okay, so I see some things emerging already. We've got a couple of folks who are here for Padlet, someone who's here for WooClap. I love this, the fancy techniques. I don't know if there's anything terribly fancy here, but we'll try and like fancy it up as we go along. So not necessarily for the traditional teaching aspect, but for a research colloquium, absolutely. So a lot of these things translate really nicely actually between techniques that you might use in a classroom to build engagement, but also techniques that you might use for a conference or a webinar, or even in staff meetings, oddly enough. So all ways that we can kind of transfer what it is that we're working on, enhancing student engagement on a postgrad level, forums engagement, other kinds of tools. Okay, fantastic. So we've got a little bit of everything going on today. We're going to keep this in the background. Hopefully we'll achieve some of these things. At the end of the webinar, we're coming back to this. So let's just hold on to that for now. So quick question for you. What is engagement? What does it look like? And because part of my goal for today is to give you as many opportunities to play as possible, there is another link going into the text chat. Oh my goodness, it's the day of links. Little link going into the text chat, which will take you to a little tool called Mentimeter. And what I'm going to ask you to do when you get to that tool is simply add an item. What is engagement? What does it look like to you? If you're having any problems with Menti, please let me know. It can sometimes be sticky. This, by the way, is not one of the tools that we're going to show today. One of the tools, the kind of closest equivalent to this is WooClap. And the only reason that I'm using Menti today is because I haven't conquered WooClap yet. Eventually, Woo Clap and I will conquer is such a bad word. Eventually, Woo Clap and I will make friends, but I'm not all the way there yet. So I'm falling back on old favorites. So in the text chat, there is a link. If you click on it, it should take you to a screen that looks somewhat like this, and you can add an option. Is anyone having a problem with that? Okay. And we're going to patiently give people a moment to type and think. Aha, there we go. What's engagement? What does it look like to you? Great. I'm glad you found that. Okay, so we've got some ideas developing. This is a really interesting idea. Engagement is about being able to be led by students. I'm going to add the link again for anyone who's missing it in the text chat. I'm going to just pop into the text chat a link. Should be directly below Adelaide's message. Awesome, got you. So engagement is about being able to be led by students. Is there someone who'd be willing to say a bit more about that? If so, do you want to unmute, grab the mic, and say a little more? It's a very interesting concept. And if not, that's absolutely fine. But if you'd be up for it, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. But let's see what else is developing so long. Engagement is about creating a space where students feel happy to return, okay, and contribute. It's a safe or brave space for sharing ideas and questions, allowing them to lead conversations. Okay, so engagement is about creating spaces where students have more rather than less control. It's about active participation. It's about getting students to think and not wait for us to entertain them. Couldn't get back to the main team site from this. Would be happy to say something. Okay, so if you're stuck in Mentimeter, you just need to close that browser, and at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little Zoom link, and you can click on that and that'll bring your Zoom back up for you. Engagement is about moving from passivity to activity. Yes. Okay. So these are all great ideas about what engagement is and about what engagement does. And just a couple of things for us to sort of consider or continue with considering. Student engagement is often sort of associated with, sometimes conflated with, or mixed up with ideas of improved, sort of ideas around motivational interaction. So we often say that our students are engaged when they're particularly motivated or when we can see interaction. And that's sometimes a little problematic. A student might be very engaged, but engaged in a way that's perhaps not always visible to us. But what we do know is that student engagement, which is quite difficult to measure at the moment, is often associated with ideas of improved achievements. So just students doing better, persistence, sticking with courses, and simply students' retention. So keeping them within the system, progressing them through the system. So there's this fairly long quote about what student engagement is, and I liked one part of it, but I thought it would be useful to share the whole thing with everyone. I like this idea of the energy and effort that students employ within their learning community. The author goes on to talk about the fact that it's observable, so engagement must be seen via behavioral, cognitive, or affective indicators. But I just like the idea of energy and effort, because sometimes you can put in a lot of energy and a lot of effort, and you don't necessarily see a result immediately. It's happening in the background, something slowly starting to warm up. And so I quite like thinking about engagement as this idea of where are we putting our energies, as a kind of slightly softer way of thinking of it than can I necessarily see with my eyeballs what my students are doing? So that's that's my working definition for today. Let's call it that. So I thought came across quite an interesting concept. Actually, this is Max came across this a while ago. So thank you, Max, for adding this to the repertoire. Thinking about how do students engage. And there's this kind of continuum from the kind of engagement we want, which is enthusiastic, authentic, committed, to a kind of engagement that we don't want, but that I think sometimes is very valuable, and particularly in the university context, may actually be kind of part of how we function, which is the idea of rebellion. So there are these categories of engagement, from a kind of very authentic engagement. I'm mad about the subject. I care about it deeply. It's going to be my life. To strategic compliance, which is I have to do well in this in order to do X. So I'm going to make the most of it. The idea of ritual compliance, I will do what pleases my educator because it behooves me to please them. Retreatism, which is I'm going to disengage. So ritual compliance is I'll do the minimum. Retreatism is I'm going to do very little to nothing at all. And rebellion is I'm going to just keep obstructing what it is that you're doing. And of all these 5 things, the ones that I think we should be most concerned about is ritual compliance, i.e. just pleasing educators for the sake of it, or retreatism. Everything else, from rebellion to me is just a different form of the ultimate engagement. And so it's sometimes useful to think about where the problem sits in our classroom. So are our students retreating? Are they ritually compliant? Because for me, any of the other, rebellion is uncomfortable. It's painful and uncomfortable, but it is still presence. So it can be very handy to think about what kind of engagement are my students really sort of displaying at any point in time. So let's think about this idea of one way of strengthening engagement, which is the idea that we might focus our attention in terms of strengthening engagement on helping students to engage with each other, on helping them to engage with educators, or helping them to engage with content. So that's my first question, or my first kind of proposal for us for the day, is that one way to think about strengthening engagement is to think about what the student is engaging with. Are they engaging with other students, with an educator, or with content? And I'm going to be cheeky, and I'm going to pop you back into that Mentimeter space. The link is once again in the text chat. And I'm going to ask you to rank these 3 ideas for me. What are you, as an educator, most interested in students engaging with? As an educator, what are you most interested in students engaging with? Do you want them to engage with the teaching team, yourself, your fellow educators, your tutors perhaps? Do you really want them to engage with other students, or do you want them to engage with content and materials? And I know the temptation is to say, I want them to engage with everything. But for your course, for right now, what's your priority? Or for your context, for right now, what is your priority? Because we cannot achieve everything all at once. So we're gonna make some hard choices. Okay, so we've got 1 vote up, and I'm going to leave people to think on it for a second. But we've got a number of folks in the room, so I'm going to give us a little bit longer. What is your particular priority around building student engagement? i.e., who do you want your students to engage with the most? We're just going to give it a few minutes for everyone to have a little bit of a chance to think about that, and maybe to do a little bit of voting. Who or what do you want your students to engage with the most? Apologies, I'm moving things around on the screen. So I think we're going to wait for a few more votes. And let's just see where we are in terms of who do we want our students to engage with. At the moment, there's sort of a leaning towards content and materials. So above everything else for my course, my priority is to get my students to do this. And it might not be like an absolute priority. So it might not be, it might just be in this context at this moment. The thing that I'm struggling to do is to get my students to interact with or to engage with. And that might be different for your course, you know, in a different year, at a different time and so on. Okay, I'm going to open, create a little opportunity for folks to unmute or to jump into the text chat in Zoom, if you would prefer. Is there something about this question that doesn't work for you? So I'm going to give folks an opportunity to say if there's something about that question that's a little bit trickier for them or doesn't quite work for them. This is an opportunity to say that.
Shalina, can I comment?
Hi, Jill, go for it.
Hi. Yeah, I think, you know, for me, because I'm very specifically in education, and ideally you want to be together with the students working on material. So it's kind of difficult in this in the online situation, because this is a hands-on. I mean, it's a method. So to actually, I mean, I'm sure other people have other challenges, but for us, it is about the content, but it's a collaborative process. So in a sense, your question separates out that idea of collaboration by ranking.
Yeah, fair enough. It does definitely do that. So you would want your students at any one moment to be able to so your primary concern is that they engage with the content with you.
And each other.
Each other.
Yeah, ideally, in a perfect world, that's exactly. You want it to be. For me, the biggest thing at the moment is collaboration.
Fair enough, and I think there's definitely sort of methods and spaces where that is a real concern. And I think what I'm trying to ask is a little bit more of a, I'm almost asking people to try and identify what's the obstacle to that at the moment for you.
Okay. Okay.
So if you think about your course and your class at the moment, what's the thing that's most challenging? So in some posts or in some classes, students are very happy to interact with their educators. They don't have a problem with that at all. They're there for that. They're okay even with interacting with materials. But the thing they really struggle with is interacting with other students in this particular mode. They're perfectly happy to interact with other students on Instagram or Twitter or TikTok or wherever in a kind of social mode. But in like a semi-professional teaching and learning mode, there's something about that space that throws them where they're not comfortable, where they're not... You know, there's this term that people throw around. They go, oh, students are digital natives. The digital world is wide and varied, and you can be a very comfortable inhabitant of TikTok and a very awkward inhabitant of an LMS or Twitter. Thank you, Lauren. That is very helpful. Let me figure out how to stop that. Okay, so... Or they could be distracted or bored or all sorts of weird things as well. Absolutely. Okay, so what I'm going to ask folks to do, and let's see if that changed it at all, maybe not. So keep thinking about where's the obstacle? What's the thing that changes your students, that kind of gets in the way of your students interacting with you. So let's move ourselves along a little bit. We're going to talk about this idea of interaction in terms of three things. We're going to start with, or they could be worried about what other students think of them. Absolutely. It's a huge, when we did a series of interviews with students a little while back about why they didn't interact, one of the things that came across very strongly was they were actually very concerned about what other students would think of them. They were less anxious in some ways about what their educators thought of them. They were deeply concerned about what their peers thought of them. And there was an absolute lack of trust in many of the relationships around them. And that's deeply terrifying. So I think what I'd like to do is to kind of move through some bits fairly quickly. And then we're going to come back to this question. Can we talk about, actually, let's pause for a second. Let's talk about that. I'm going to stop sharing for a bit, and I'm going to turn on my camera. And I'm going to ask that if anyone would like to, that they jump in, because I think this is a difficult question. So how do we deal with the issue of trust?
Shanali, I can try.
Okay. Go for it.
I can use my problem-based learning setting as an example. So in day one or week one, we have ground rules. So that is how we start. In terms of what are some of the non-negotiables, the expectations, because it's a student-centered pedagogy, the facilitators work with the students and establish the ground rules, which are tailor-made for that specific group. And it normally works because they work together for the whole semester, work with each other. And there is a lot of openness, and if they don't know anything, they weren't hesitant in asking their peers for input, and it's that's collaborative learning really works in my context. Thank you.
Thank you. So what's interesting there is you have stable groups, right?
That's correct.
So you and this little group of how many people in the group?
About 11 max.
Right. So a student and their 10-ish compatriots are going to travel through a semester together.
That's right.
So if they burn a bridge, it's burned for the semester, and beyond. So there's an incentive to commitment.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. That's an interesting methodology. Jane, do you want to? Thank you very much, Jay. Jane, do you want to talk about what you're suggesting?
Just to say, if that is a prevalent concern, it needs to be addressed up front. It's not something that I've had a lot of experience with. Certainly, I'm thinking with our postgraduate master's program coming up, it is something we will need to address more, because it's a smaller group and the interaction that we're expecting from them this year, with it being entirely virtual, will be far greater. So I'm looking forward to hearing from those who have had more experience about directly engaging learners around this. I'm hoping also by the time they get to masters that perhaps they do feel less concerned about others and more comfortable in the online space, but perhaps that's a vain hope. Thanks.
Thanks very much, James. I think the postgraduate picture is a little bit different. Jane, you were talking about safety.
Well, I think this is a huge conversation, and thank you for the opportunity to open it. I think that not all of us as teachers have had very good education ourselves, one way and another, in the negotiation of emotion in spaces. And some disciplines, the idea that emotion should play a part at all in what you're doing is actually anathema. You know, if you're trained to be a surgeon, you shouldn't be having
feelings.
Yeah, even though, of course, you are. So this is a whole zone of discussion. It's a very powerful zone around affect. And there's a lot of critical work on it, both theoretically and pedagogically. But just practically, I find that I do an enormous amount of teaching about what you do with emotions in the academic space, whether those emotions are boredom or irritation or the occasional fury or confusion. What does that zone of information bring to the possibility of engagement with content material? I teach in a discipline which makes it fairly essential to do this.
Yeah.
I think it's probably important for all of us, particularly as our students on the whole are sitting in isolation, working with us. They are in their own laptops. They are in very emotional spaces and we can't see them. So we have no way of reading that and have to find ways of bringing an embodiment into the screen. It's often very useful to use voice.
Yeah.
It's extremely useful to use voice.
And
Anyway,
particularly, no, thank you. No, I think that's very, very useful. So I think what we've sort of tapped into here is that there are kind of technicalities around engagement. There are tools that we need to get used to. There are strategies we might use. There are ways that we might think kind of cognitively about where engagement is appropriate or not appropriate in a particular learning experience for our students, or where we might want it to sit. Let's put it that way, where we might want to invite engagement. But ultimately, as that idea, that sort of quote suggested, it's about energy and it's about more than just what goes on in the brain. It's about more than a cognitive activity. It's about more than a behavioral, something we can see activity. It's an affective activity. It's something that people are going to feel. And so one of the things that we absolutely need to be able to do in terms of engagement is to think a little bit about how do we create spaces that help our students to navigate what they feel in those spaces. Yes, so one of the options around thinking about affect in the classroom is a pedagogy of discomfort. It's one of the many different approaches to dealing with affect in the classroom, and it's a very useful one in the context particularly of disciplines that actively seek to challenge students' fundamental assumptions about the world, or indeed their own assumptions about the world. Okay, we are heading very close to time for breakouts. So I'm going to skip a little bit in my plan. I just want to ask a quick question though before we go any further. In terms of your sense of what gets in the way of you being able to manage engagement with your students, what for you is something that you really, really want to, what do you think that thing is? Is it an affect issue? Is it a kind of, I mean, it's always going to be a mess, a tangle of affect and behavior and cognition. And this is not something I need you to answer out loud. I'd like you to just sort of hang on to this for yourself. What's the obstacle for your students? And maybe just think about, as we start to move forward in the session, what can we do to address that obstacle? And it's going to be a little bit different for everyone. Okay, so to kind of slip us back a little bit, I'm going to ask you to pop into the text chat for me something that you like to do with your students that helps them to engage with their peers. Okay, so are there any particular activities that you like to do with your students that help them to engage with their peers? Anyone with any particular activities that they want to jump in and share? And if the idea of typing it out is far too horrific, I would love to invite you to unmute and to share a couple of those ideas. Jay.
Shanali?
Yeah.
It's not just about the content. We do kind of icebreakers. In a face-to-face, those energizers, icebreakers used to work very well. So I wanted to kind of try something creative. I think I ordered some learning tools from takealot.com, you know, the kits where you each one get a cube with a question written on the 4 sides of the cubes. And I just kind of worked with the students that it really worked well. You know, in terms
Jay, this
of
sounds like a very cute thing. Do you
yes.
do you have a link or a picture or a cube lying around that you want to show us?
Yes, I can try. Let me just quickly, maybe I will give others a chance. Let me go quickly find the cubes.
Okay, great. Just one of them if it's somewhere close by. If not, don't stress.
Sure.
Okay, so what do we have? So some groups use pods, like Jane is saying, small audio groups within TUTs. Get students to do a task together to get them to connect with each other. And Jane's saying she's got a big class, 420 students. TUT groups are 22, and each TUT group meets asynchronously and synchronously in pods. So one of the things that I think that is very, very different in the online space compared to the face-to-face space is in a face-to-face space, you would probably have people you would have them in a physically constrained space. And so you can simply say, sit in a group of 4 with your group, and you have 5 minutes together, or 10 minutes together, or half an hour together, and the room is pandemonium for that period of time. But you can also see people engaging with each other, and you can go and kind of nudge people when they need to be nudged. And I think in the face-to-face space, that is somewhat harder. Oh, sorry, in the online space, that's somewhat harder because you can't be in all those spaces at once. You can kind of move around the groups, but you don't have the same sort of like big sense of what's happening in my room. Okay, so we've got a couple of suggestions in the text chat for how we might do that. And I think those are very useful. Are there any particular suggestions that people have for how you might get students specifically to, I'm going to change the frame a little bit, and I'm going to offer the idea of engagement at different times. So I'm just going to very, very quickly share my screen. This will be a very 1-second activity. And then we'll jump back into the group. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so that people can see it. One of the ways that I find useful to think about engagement, and this may be different for different people in the room, is I like to think about engagement over time. So at the beginning of a course, what am I doing to increase the possibility of engagement, to invite engagement? During the course, what am I doing to do that? And then towards the end of the course, what are we doing? So I'm going to ask you to perhaps think about that frame and see if that frame fits better than dividing engagement up into who you engage with. So let's take some comments on that frame for a second. So James is saying, convene a journal club for medical students so that, I'm assuming med is medical. So they need to work in small groups to prep and present it. More challenging is getting the groups to engage with each other during journal club. Okay, yes, that is often our challenge. Jay, do you want to turn your camera on? And
Sure,
show us
Shanali.
things.
Let me just turn my camera on. Okay. So
I'm going to turn my camera off so that you are a big camera for
okay.
most people.
Okay.
Go for it.
So Shanali, can you see? These are the kind of cubes. I have it like different colors.
Yeah.
And each side will have a question. For example, name something you're afraid of. This is like really works in a virtual space much better, because in a face-to-face, it's very different. Students see, each other and the body language, etc. So this really worked well, when I just kind of introduced myself and the students introduced to each other. So this is like, if I'm not mistaken, it's about $200 from Take a Lot, and it might be on a special. So it has got like 6 colors. So I put it in a bowl. I think this is like some cooking utensil. And then I just normally use it from time to time.
Okay. So you just kind of give them a shake, pick one out, and what you get is what they, fantastic. That's very cool. And that, I imagine those are all quite personal questions, right?
Yes. What's your happiest memory? And it's nothing kind of sensitive. When is your birthday, or what book do you like? Name one thing you like about yourself. So very general kind of questions.
Fantastic. And those would be the kind of things that you would use maybe at some point in, like maybe at the beginning of a session?
That's correct.
As a kind of like icebreaker, get to know each other more. And you do that the whole way through term, right?
Yes, yeah.
So that's
I just identify, different time points. For example, I can pick up if students are stressed out about assessments, then I said, hey guys, come, why don't we play? And most of the time they quite curious to really play the game. Just for 5-6 minutes max.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Jay. That's a great suggestion. Okay, folks, what I'm going to do, I think, is I'm going to pop us into, I think we must pop into the breakout room so you can meet some of the tools, because I know that some people were here specifically for that. And then we'll come back out of the breakout rooms and we can chat a little bit more about some of these bigger issues that we're dealing with. So I just have to pop us into the breakout rooms. Apologies, this will take me 1 second. While we are endeavoring to get the breakout room sorted, are there any particular... Sorry, I'm going to just focus on setting up the breakout rooms. In the meanwhile, if there are any comments or questions, please pop them into the text chat. I will be 30 seconds longer. Okay, so there are 4 breakout rooms in round 1. There is Padlet, there is WooClap, there is forums, and there are comments. And I'm going to open all the rooms. You will get an invite that allows you to choose which room you want to go to. And you will need to go to that room. Okay, so the rooms are opening now, and you will have an option to choose what room you want to go to.